Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the first Writing for the Earth Ecocriticism Symposium. Hello as well to the people joining us virtually. We have people on YouTube as well. There will be a 15-minute intermission halfway through, where you can pop to the loo if you wish and get a few more canapes as well, if you want. Why are we doing this? Why indeed? Well, Amanda is a fellow PhD researcher in English here at Ulster, and we noticed that despite the David Attenborough documentaries and things like that, there is a lack of engagement with eco-criticism outside of academia. So we wanted to set up a public symposium rather than a stuffy academic conference to rectify that. You can check our Twitter, Writing for Earth, that's our Twitter handle, for the symposium pack and schedule. To start, we have our head of school, Dr. Catherine White, to say a few words. And Catherine will be followed by our research director, Dr. Frank Ferguson. Thank you very much.
Hello. Now, don't panic. I do have a copy of Ulysses, but I am not going to give you a lecture. So welcome, everyone, to this wonderful event. And thank you to Amanda and to Connor for envisioning it and then indeed orchestrating it and pulling it together. And it is, I hope, the first of many such events that will explore literature and the environment and indeed humanity's detrimental impact upon it. But I think what strikes us tonight is just how brilliant it is to be together, right? In a room, in person. And welcome to those online, of course, too. And I think we are recognising these moments as we move back to these sort of normal rhythms of being together, and these rhythms that, of course, the pandemic had made us had stopped for us. But I think what's interesting is we look back, I suppose, over the last couple of years, and what have we learned, and what did we learn during that time? And of course, I think for many of us, the last 2 years has been a real chance, I suppose, to connect or indeed reconnect with nature as the world stopped and we got outside and we all looked forward to that sort of daily walk and thought about our environments. And I think to many nations, of course, including the UK, responded to the pandemic by restricting travel and other activities during 2020 and 21. As you all know, and as you've heard the reports, this caused a temporary reduction in global greenhouse gas emissions and local air pollutions. And suddenly across the world, people were able to breathe more easily. People were able to see as visibility returned to cities. And of course, as we have learned, and you can look up, I'm not going to bore you with the sort of details. A lot of this information is found on the Met Office, who issued a report on this, of course, last year. But this, of course, caused this temporary reduction in greenhouse gas emissions and local air pollution. But it was a temporary reduction. And of course, 7% actually, which was unprecedented up to that point. But it still means, as the statistics show us, that 93% of normal emissions went into the atmosphere and carbon dioxide levels continue to build up. So, of course, we have this rhetoric now of how do we build back greener as we come out of the pandemic? What do we do about that? And, of course, our attention was focused again last year at the UN Climate Change Conference in Glasgow, COP26, which brought together 120 world leaders and over 40,000 registered participants across 2 weeks as we all thought about how do we respond to climate change. So we're all in this zone right now of thinking about this. And this is why I think this event is also so important as we think about ecology and sustainability. Both of these things, ecology and sustainability, are huge buzzwords right now and hugely significant as we think what it means to be a sustainable community. And I think we all have a role to play in that, and how brilliant to be at a conference like this, where there's no printouts, right? There's no visible conference packs, which is why I didn't print out my notes. I brought them on screen. You can see recyclable water bottles at the front of the stage. And the fact that this event is hybrid as well, I think, ties into this point of how we have to be responsible, not just within the academic community, but within communities generally, as we go forward and we think about these issues and stage these events to think about these issues. So it's really interesting to see, I think, this ethical approach to tonight's proceedings. So as we think about eco-criticism as a mode of reading, and I'm not going to say a lot about eco-criticism because I'm not going to take away from Conor's first speech, but eco-criticism, of course, helps us to understand and to examine ourselves, right, and the world or the environment that we inhabit, both the natural world and indeed the urban. And I think it's interesting in section 3, don't panic, I'm bringing out Ulysses. In section 3 of Ulysses, I just find the reference, and this is just in the opening paragraph of it. In the opening paragraph, this is where one of the main protagonists, Stephen Dedalus, walks along Sandy Mount Strand, which is just south, a beach just south of Dublin. And if you're ever there, you know it, you see the urban environment in the background. And he says this famous line of signatures of all things I am here to read. Sea spawn and sea wrack, the nearing tide, that rusty boot, snot green, blue, silver, rust, coloured signs. It's really interesting, I think, and some critics describe Stephen as the best interpreter in literature. Why is he described like that? Because he has the gift of reading the world. And I think this is really significant because when we think about writing the earth, we cannot write the earth unless we can first read the earth and be attuned to what is happening within our environment. So I think it's really interesting, and I was delighted to see that on tonight's panels, there's a mix of scholars and indeed practitioners, academics and creative writers. And there's those that are indeed both, and they are just show-offs, right? But they're here too. And I think it's really interesting because we need these people to be writing about our environments so that we can read. And first of all, they need to be reading those environments so that they can write. And here I think you find this link between the topography, the earth, and the tongue, or the planet and the pen. And that's the exciting thing as we think about some of the themes we're going to be thinking about tonight is the role of literature and how we respond to that as humans within the place that we find ourselves. So I wish you all a fantastic evening. I know I'm really excited about the talks that are coming up, and I'll hand you over now to our research director, Dr. Frank Ferguson.
We are in a place that, translated from the ancient Irish, means the ferny nook, a place that deals with the concept of habitation and habitat. And tonight we're going to look at the meanings that language can inscribe about the natural world. We might inscribe the way the world has been treated with great anger and with great sorrow. But as students in the humanities, and particularly students of literature and writers of literature, we have a hope that all is not lost, and indeed much can be saved. And tonight, my colleagues, my wonderful colleagues, PhD researchers, members of staff, alumni, are going to share their language of nature with you. And we hope that we will live in a world in the future that is a protected world, that is a world that we learn to overcome the grievances that we have visited upon it. And we do this because ultimately we are creatures of language that can move beyond the difficulties of the past. So I pass on to my colleagues now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Frank and Catherine, for those wonderful words. They certainly start the evening on the right foot. So to start, we will have Conor James, who is a PhD researcher at Ulster University. He's particularly interested in the ways which ecofeminism permeates the lives and works of William Wordsworth and his sister Dorothy. Destabilizing gender dualism in their sometimes revolutionary, sometimes genteel ways, gender roles and social expectations melt away in their poetry, prose and home life. I'd like to introduce Conor James.
Well, first of all, it makes sense to introduce eco-criticism. It's a term that some might not be familiar with. So I'm going to use William Wordsworth. As Amanda said, he's one of the main focuses of my PhD to do that. So first of all, what is it? Cheryl Glotfelty, the eco-critic, has a snappy summation of eco-criticism here. She says simply that eco-criticism is the study of the relationship between literature and the physical environment. The physical environment encompassing, as Catherine said, the natural world and the built man-made environment as well. So while feminist criticism examines language and literature from a gender-conscious perspective, eco-criticism takes an earth-centered approach to literary studies. And that is well and good, but why does it matter? It matters because, according to Timothy Clark, human actions have, inadvertently, triggered a profound and irreversible change in the operations of the Earth system. Global warming, essentially climate change, pollution, things like that. We are in what some have called the Anthropocene. That means that human beings now, in our current epoch, are more important than the world in which we live. Here's a visual metaphor for that, if you like. Central Park in New York, segregated away. Human beings may be seen as colonizers, dominating and segregating the natural environment into national trust properties, parks, national parks, while the urban sprawl expands. Sure, we remember last year the Western wildfires in the United States. Greg Pope, professor of Earth and Environmental Studies, comments on how very unprecedented these fires were. He said it's unusual to have this kind of haze. I don't recall seeing this kind of thing, which is worrying. Even more worrying is that these fires haven't subsided. I'm sure we're all aware of this. These are just some headlines from The Guardian here. Everything was orange. US wildfires burning at furious pace early this year. Turning the dial up, US Southwest braces for extended wildfire season amid drastic drought. So, with it established what eco-criticism is, why it's important, and that our world is in dire straits, where does William Wordsworth fit in exactly? Quaint William Wordsworth. We know from his most famous poem, I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud, that he appreciates nature. That much is certain. I know it's his most famous poem because the tea towels all had it at the Wordsworth Grassmere gift shop, which I visited in April, which was lovely. So you can't read that, of course, so I've just pulled out a few relevant lines here. Continuous as the stars that shine and twinkle on the Milky Way, they stretched in never-ending line along the margin of a bay. Which is all very pleasant, but does it get to the climate crisis? Does it get to the root of things? Not really. It's more of an appreciation and not much more. Jump ahead several years from 1804 to 1807, and we have Wordsworth's poem, the world is too much with us. And in a short time, it seems that Wordsworth latched on to the greed, the materialism that was taking hold just at the very, very beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So I shall read this poem. It's worth reading, I think. The world is too much with us. Late and soon, getting and spending, we lay waste our powers. Little we see in nature that is ours. We have given our hearts away, a sordid boon, the sea that bears her bosom to the moon, the winds that will be howling at all hours, and are upgathered now like sleeping flowers. For this, for everything, we are out of tune. It moves us not. Great God, I'd rather be a pagan suckled in a creed outworn. So might I, standing on this pleasant lea, have glimpses that would make me less forlorn, have sight of Proteus rising from the sea, or hear old Triton blow his wreathed horn. Wordsworth wants to go back to a pagan world, free from materialism and greed. Then further on, he wants to go back even more. He wants to melt into Greek mythology. We have Triton mentioned there. He's a Greek god of the sea, Poseidon's son. And Proteus, shepherd of the sea, shepherd of the sea's flocks, seals mainly. So Wordsworth, he wants to go back. He wants to be free from materialism and greed. As Jonathan Bate, biographer of Wordsworth, states, the world of materialistic getting and spending lays waste to our power to love. Love each other and love our planet. You know, how can we possibly love one another if we cannot love the world in which we inhabit? And it will in time lay waste to the very world upon which we rely for survival. Jumping forward again to The Excursion, Wordsworth's long poem of 1814. He says, what lamentable change a year, a month may bring, that brook converting as it runs into an instrument of deadly bane. There, the character in The Excursion, the wanderer, has revisited a riverbank, and he's found that a factory has been built, so he can't drink from the brook. Wordsworth's focus on time here, I think, is striking. What lamentable change a year, a month. Well, indeed, look at the damage that we've done to the planet in 2022, never mind 1814. It shows that Wordsworth, although he wasn't a clairvoyant, none of us are, he couldn't have foreseen precisely what would have happened to our world. He nevertheless charts the start of the climate crisis here, the very beginnings of the Industrial Revolution. And continuing on with water pollution there's quite an arresting image from National Geographic. Children on the shore of Manila Bay in the Philippines, which is polluted by plastic waste. That plastic waste which will kill Proteus's flock. To finish on a quote from Sir David Attenborough, one of the greatest, if not the greatest ecologist of our time. He says, lakes will not remain full of fish, even when those living on their shores take the greatest trouble to prevent pollution. If factories in another country spout their fumes so high into the air they contaminate the clouds and turn to rain, which falls days later and hundreds of miles away, into acid. So again, we see that Wordsworth couldn't possibly have known this. However, his evocation of a factory there in The Excursion shows that he was aware of what humans were doing, of the detrimental impact of humanity on the world even then. That was a very brief introduction to eco-criticism, but I hope it was a useful one, and thank you very much for listening.
So next up, we have Dr. Andrew Keeney, who is going to do a talk on We're Not Out of the Woods. Dr. Andrew Keeney is a lecturer in English at Ulster University. He has published widely on the English Romantics. Most recently, he has published Genius Disregarded, Selected Poems of Hartley Coleridge. He also has a collection of his own poems, My Cave Art. I'd like to welcome Dr. Keeney.
Okay, there's a problem with nature writing. The words can alienate us from non-human nature, even as they try to connect us. Wordsworth knew this, even when he sat in his grove, reclined and mindful, birdsong all around, notebook in hand. His friend, that incurable optimist, Coleridge, wanted to celebrate the lovely shapes and sounds intelligible of that eternal language which thy God utters. But Wordsworth couldn't stop feeling increasingly rattled by nature's unintelligible shapes and sounds. Wordsworth's poem, Lines Written in Early Spring, 1798, seems initially to suggest that nature is preferable to humanity. I heard 1,000 blended notes while in a grove I sat reclined, in that sweet mood when pleasant thought brings sad thought to the mind. To her fair works did nature link the human soul that through me ran, and much it grieved my heart to think what man has made of man. So the poem opens with a feeling of connection to the natural landscape. Nature's notes are blended, and the speaker himself feels blended with the notes. There's a sense that he has a soul within him that connects him to the song of the earth, to the spirit in the natural world. So here's the speaker feeling in harmony with the natural world. And this leads him, strangely enough, to feel sad, because he can imagine what it's like to not be connected. Yeah? The feeling of joy can cause us to imagine the absence of joy. It can cause us to lament that we cannot feel joy all the time. So there's melancholy in those first two stanzas of this poem, but also a sense of the harmony of the natural world. But, you know, when I look at humankind, I don't see much harmony at all. I see division, hypocrisy, violence, war. Anyhow, that's the main distinction here. Nature is good, humankind is bad. Now, that's all very wise, isn't it? So I think Wordsworth, with that wisdom and omniscience, yeah, take it or leave it, okay? He's something of an ancient monument to, of English romantic environmentalism. If the Lake District were pharaonic Egypt, Wordsworth would be the Sphinx, yeah? The poem gets more odd. I'm on the same poem here. The poet has three things that he observes when he sits in his grove. He sees the periwinkle trail, its wreaths. He says he hopes the flowers enjoy the air they breathe, yeah? And then he sees birds hopping about, and he thinks, well, I want to, I have to believe that these birds enjoy hopping about, yeah? And then he sees twigs, with catching the wind, and he thinks, well, I really hope that those twigs enjoy the wind blowing through them. Well, there's not a sense now that nature's in harmony with itself and so on. There's more of a sense of, I have no idea what nature is doing or feeling, but I sure hope it feels what I want it to feel. Yeah. So the poet is not in harmony with the natural world. He feels disconnected from it. Look, maybe the whole Sphinx thing, right? Forget about that. Wordsworth, maybe he's the voice that you hear if you're not taking your meds. Yeah. So the poem ends rather strangely. If this belief from heaven be sent, if such be nature's holy plan, have I not reason to lament what man has made of man? There's no lush romantic amplitude here. There's no comfortable pathetic fallacy. That is, there's no straightforward tendency to credit nature with human emotions. This is doubt. It's not affirmation. This is a dramatization of the human need to find meaning in the natural world. There's not much encouraging meaning to be found in human behavior, is there? So, he drives him into the natural world. Human behavior has, after all, brought about, for example, global warming. More specifically, global warming is about consumption of the richest people on the planet. 50% of global emissions are emitted by just 10% of the population. 90% of global emissions are emitted by 50% of the population. We perhaps know a bit more now than Wordsworth about what, flowers and birds and trees feel, and maybe how they feel it. Wood Wide Web, anyone? Yeah. But I think we can also, as we always could, see through the politics and the policing of our paradise, privatized, of our apocalypse, bureaucratized. And I want to spend the rest of this presentation looking at the very human problem I have in mind through the lens of G.K. Chesterton. There he is in all his glory. It's an essay, Some Policeman and a Moral. The other day, I was nearly arrested by two excited policemen in a wood in Yorkshire. I was on holiday and was engaged in that rich and intricate mass of pleasures, duties, and discoveries, which for the keeping off of the profane, we disguise by the exoteric name of nothing. At the moment in question, I was throwing a big Swedish knife at a tree, practicing, alas, without success, that useful trick of knife throwing by which men murder each other in Stevenson's romances. Suddenly, the forest was full of two policemen, cops 2 and 6. Yeah? There was something about their appearance in and relation to the greenwood that reminded me, I know not how, of some happy Elizabethan comedy. They asked what the knife was, who I was, why I was throwing it, what my address was, trade, religion, opinions on the Japanese war, name of favourite cat, and so on. They also said I was damaging the tree, which was, I'm sorry to say, not true, because I could not hit it. The peculiar philosophical importance, however, of the incident was this. After some half hour's animated conversation, the exhibition of an envelope, an unfinished poem, which was read with great care, and I trust with some profit, and 1 or 2 other subtle detective strokes, the elder of the two knights became convinced that I really was what I professed to be, that I was a journalist, that I was on the Daily News. This was the real stroke. They were shaken with the terror common to all tyrants. That I lived in a particular place as stated, and that I was stopping with particular people in Yorkshire who happened to be wealthy and well known in the neighbourhood. In fact, the leading constable became so genial and complimentary at last that he ended up by representing himself as a reader of my work. Well, when that was said, everything was settled. They acquitted me and let me pass. But, I said, what of that mangled tree? It was to the rescue of that dryad tethered to the earth that you rushed like knight-errants. You, the higher humanitarians, are not deceived by the seeming stillness of the green thing. That tree, that ruin of its former self, the wreck of what was once a giant of the forest, now splintered and laid low by the brute superiority of a Swedish knife, that tragedy, constable, cannot be wiped out. I made the later and larger part of that speech to the silent wood, for the two policemen had vanished, almost as quickly as they came. It is very possible, of course, that they were fairies. In that case, the somewhat illogical character of their view of crime, law, and personal responsibility would find a bright and elfish explanation. Perhaps if I had lingered in the glade till moonrise, I might have seen rings of tiny policemen dancing on the sward, or running about with glowworm belts, arresting grasshoppers for damaging blades of grass. But taking the bolder hypothesis that they really were policemen, I find myself in a certain difficulty. I was certainly accused of something which was either an offence or was not. I was let off because I proved I was a guest at a big house. The inference seems painfully clear. Suppose a poor person, poorer even than a journalist, had been intoxicated with the green gaiety of the ancient wood. Suppose he had thrown knives at trees and could give no description of a dwelling place, except that he had been fired out of the last. As I walked home through a cloudy and purple twilight, I wondered how he would have got on. Cheers.
So next up, we have Dr. Kevin Darnellis. He's going to discuss polluted rivers, polluted behaviour, toxic environments and toxic masculinities in 3 modern plays. He's a lecturer in English literature at Ulster University. He serves on the management committee of the Riverside Theatre, Coleraine. He specialises in the representation of animals and the environment in early modern and modern drama. He's also the author of The Horse in Early Modern English culture, and the author of Focus on the Wesker Trilogy, also the co-editor of the Wiley Blackwell Companion to Contemporary Literature. He has published over a dozen peer-reviewed essays on literature and culture in journals and essay collections, dozens of book reviews, a dozen play reviews, and hundreds of encyclopedia articles. He has supervised a number of eco-criticism-based PhDs and delivered scores of conference papers.
Just show me what to do here. Simple as that. Okay.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks very much. Thanks to the organisers of this rather splendid event. I want to start with a quote from my second favourite academic, a chap called Peter Barry, partly because I want to draw attention to this wonderful essay collection that Peter put together a couple of years ago, but partly because there's a quote in it that, although ostensibly about something from the natural world, is, I think, something that could be very readily applied to literary texts. Now, Peter, in this particular essay from that collection, he's interested in rather blurring the boundaries between the natural world and creative processes and outputs. Catherine, he would absolutely love your comments about Daedalus and the Sandy Mount rocks. So Peter says here, rocks and stones are always in a state of flux and transition. A rock might look like it hasn't changed in 40 million years, but it has changed. Things change. Nothing is permanent. Literary texts are like that because the meaning of a literary text changes every time it's received by a reader. King Lear will never mean the same thing to 2 different people in 2 different places. So whatever much of a behemoth a literary text may seem, it changes when we respond to it. Now, think about 2022. I think that the 2 major issues afflicting this world are, number 1, irrational violence, mainly against women, and secondly, ecological degradation. Those are the 2 pressing issues. And I don't really need to tell this panel or this audience how those things are related. Simply, if someone kicks their cat, they're probably going to kick a woman too. If someone destroys Ukraine, they're probably not going to be too worried about pollution levels in the Black Sea. Violence, irrational violence, including misogynist violence, and ecological degradation are profoundly linked. So I think that Peter Barry's quote and this sort of approach to literary criticism empowers us because in 2022, we can project legitimately all of our concerns about gendered violence and ecological degradation onto historical texts. Indeed, the 3 plays that I will look at are written at a time when the phrase toxic masculinity wasn't in currency. They were written when ecological degradation was scarcely being noticed. Yet, from my 2022 perspective, I can clearly say that these three plays are plays about misogynist violence and plays about ecological degradation. The two things go together. Now, the first play I will refer to is a play written by Noel Coward. Noel Coward is, in my view, one of the greatest playwrights of the 20th century. He's not fashionable in academic circles in the way that Brecht, Miller, Beckett, and Pinter are. And I think this is because that Noel Coward tends to write about very glamorous things. He writes about glamorous rich people living a fairly idyllic life generally. You might think they're escapist. Brecht, of course, writes about grubby salesmen, as does Arthur Miller. Samuel Beckett writes about tramps. Harold Pinter writes about caretakers and criminals and transient folk. So Coward generally writes about the upper crust. They're glamorous plays. Now, note please in particular that when Coward wrote plays for himself and his best friend Gertie Lawrence to star in, these tended to be particularly glamorous plays. There they are doing glamorous things with glamorous clothes, with glamorous jewellery and makeup in glamorous locations. That's important because in still life, we get a very different vision of Coward and Lawrence. Look at that picture there. Look at Gertie Lawrence playing the down-at-heel housewife. It exudes greyness. Look at her with her cigarette. Look at her with her gin and tonic. Look at Coward beside her. Look at that aggressive male hand manipulating her. Look at his ridiculous spithe moustache. He looks like Private Walker from Dad's Army. He hasn't taken his hat off indoors. A criminal offence, I would have thought, in the 1930s. In short, he's not a gentleman. This is a slap in the face for Coward's audience in the 30s. We want to see Gertie and Noel having a dance and a song and a laugh. But here we see in this play exploitation of a vulnerable woman by a grotty and seedy doctor. Now, what happens is that Mrs. Jesson gets a little bit of dirt in her eye, a little bit of railway pollution. Steam railways might look romantic from our perspective, but they were filthy. British railway stations were desperately polluted at this period. So pollution invades the body of Mrs. Jesson. The doctor should, of course, help her out, then walk away. But oh no, he sees a seduction opportunity. He pursues her. And pursue her he does. Then he tries to impress her by pretending to care about what pollution does to the average person in Britain, the average worker. Listen to him mansplaining about pollution here. Conditions cause disease. Common sense, hygiene, coal mines, inhalation of dust, anthracosis, chalicosis, metal dust, steelwork, silicosis, stone dust. That's gold mines. All this is to give the impression that he's a caring person. He cares about people and he cares about the environment. He cares about nothing. And by the way, what gold mines are there in Britain? Talking through his rear end, it's all contrived to make him sound like a nice person. He isn't. Now, he has his way with Mrs. Jesson. And then Scarpers. The damage has been done and he clears off to South Africa. Like Raffles, I'm sure some of you know Raffles, the great gentleman thief who sought redemption in Africa. Well, Harvey does exactly the same thing. His toxic behaviour, seduction and flight, it's facilitated by a physical connection and an amoral reference to Britain's hyper-industrial pollution. material pollution of the environment, and toxic male behaviour. Each is facilitating the other. In the second play, The Death of a Salesman, we see another toxic male. Death of a Salesman is an Aristotelian tragedy in the Sophoclean or Shakespearean tradition, but it's also, I would suggest, an ecological tragedy. Because Willie Loman, on some instinctive level, understands emotionally that his life is inhuman, that he lives a life disconnected from nature, but he doesn't understand it. Let me explain. He rails against the unnatural neighbourhood he lives in, complains about the way they boxed us in here, bricks and windows, windows and bricks. Look at that poetic repetition. The street's full of cars, there's no fresh air, the grass doesn't grow, you can't raise a carrot. We used to have lovely trees, but they cut them down. They massacred the neighbourhood. He normally speaks in monosyllables, but here he stresses these long words. They massacred the neighbourhood. Look at that balance. They massacred the neighbourhood. And then he goes into this sort of prelapsarian fantasy about how the good old days there was no pollution. So Loman feels instinctively that modern capitalistic life is causing an unnatural scenario. But he doesn't understand that he's part of the problem. Now, Willie has delusions of grandeur. His family have to have new things. He's bought into disposability or throwaway culture. Note his misogynist aggression here. Willie sees that his wife is trying to mend her stockings, but he angrily takes them from her. I won't have you mending stockings. Throw them out. His wife isn't allowed to reuse things. His wife isn't allowed to act frugally and in an ecologically sound manner. So listen to this irrational male voice. He feels ecological degradation, but he doesn't understand that he's part of the problem. That is his tragedy. It's a tragedy of both gender and environment. He doesn't see the connection between the unnatural lifestyle that he has and his own participation in hypercapitalism. Now, in the last play I want to mention, we see ecological degradation writ quite large. It's a play called A Taste of Honey by Sheila Delaney. That's Delaney on the left there. On the right, you will see a genuine photograph of Salford in the 1950s where the play is set. Salford was not exactly gentrified in the 1950s. It had seriously been left behind during that great phase of austerity Britain. A Taste of Honey is a grotty play about grotty people doing grotty things in a massively ecologically polluted environment. Now, A Taste of Honey it's a rewrite of Othello, essentially. In Othello and A Taste of Honey, a toxic, irrational black man destroys a vulnerable white woman. Othello kills his Desdemona. Well, the black boy in this play destroys his Desdemona in a different way. Now, a crucial thing about A Taste of Honey is that all the characters notice the dirt and the pollution, but the black African boy is most vocal about it. I hate dirt. This is the dirtiest place I've ever seen. The children round here are filthy. Now, you'll notice when racists talk about minority groups, they invariably refer to dirt. Dirty Jews, dirty blacks, dirty Poles, whatever. Imagine 1950s England, a white audience. This is the era of the Notting Hill race rats. Imagine a white audience listening to a black African man berating English pollution levels and English squalor. It's a very ironic moment of post-colonial thought, I think. So the boy rejects dirty English children so much that he rejects his child that's growing in Joe's womb. He gets Joe pregnant and scarpers to Africa, just like Dr. Harvey does in Still Life. The boy rejects Joe in the same way that Dr. Harvey rejects Mrs. Jessup, uses and leaves. He will go to Africa, where his behaviour probably won't be much better. Toxic masculinity doesn't end at Dover. Heaven knows what havoc Dr. Harvey will wreak in Africa. So, my conclusion is really inescapable. In these plays, men invade the bodies of women in a way that material pollution invades the bodies of the nature of England and America. The boy's ultimate contempt for Joe is not dissimilar to the contempt for the environment that is obvious in the background of the play. Alec Harvey's contempt for the woman he seduces and uses is not dissimilar to the contempt that we have for an environment, the contempt that leads to smoky, polluted conditions in the first place. Toxic masculinity and toxic misuse of the environment, I'm finding it increasingly difficult to separate those two things. And I will just say thank you very much and bye-bye from Fluffy Jr. and myself. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kevin, and thank you to Fluffy as well. It's always a pleasure to see everybody's pets. Next up, we have Alyssa Hemphill. Alyssa is a final year PhD student researcher at Ulster University. She teaches English at NWRC, and her research interests include literary and cultural representations of animals and the environment and early modern literature. Pass it over to yourself, Alyssa.
Thank you, Amanda, and good evening to everyone who's here joining us, and hello to everyone who's watching online. Tonight, I'm going to very briefly talk about these two collections of short stories. These are very new books to me. I just read them this January for the first time, so these are very much my first thoughts on reading these. And perhaps if you're thinking about some summer reading and you haven't read either of these before, you might like to put them on your list. I'm sure they're available at all good bookshops and possibly some not so good ones too. So let's start with Percival Everett, who's a contemporary American writer. Let's start with his short story collection. So the first story I want to look at is this one called Alluvial Deposits. And this story features an American hydrologist called Robert Hawks, and he travels to Dotson in Utah because he's been tasked with trying to get access to an elderly old lady called Mrs. Bickers, trying to get access to her land so that he can get her permission to come into her land and do some water tests on the nearby creeks. Mrs. Bickers is elderly, as I said, but she's also a horrible, horrible racist. And Robert Hawks is black. So when he meets Mrs. Bickers, he is not listened to. He's driven from her land and he's subjected to a tirade of racial abuse. As the story of Hawks trying to gain Mrs. Bickers' signature continues, he contemplates the significance that water has to all life on Earth. He considers that alongside the seemingly never-ending cycle of humans conquering more land, creating more settlements, acquiring and utilising more animals. And as he's having these thoughts about water, he reflects. Though I had studied water most of my adult life, I could never quite believe the fact that there never really is any new water. Water falls, drains, flows, evaporates, condenses, falls again. That thought can be unsettling, given what we do to water, what we rinse with it, and what we put into it. Hawke's words here remind us that there is a limit to the natural resources on this planet, and it's also a call for a limitation to be placed on our use of them. The second half of this quotation deals with the negative consequences of human activity on the planet's natural resources. Despite the best intentions from humans to keep the waste byproducts of mining out of the water sources, this pollutant insidiously still finds a way into the tributaries, the creeks, the rivers, the reservoirs. Here, Percival confronts us with how activities harm the earth, just as in this story he also confronts us with incidents of racism that exist in our world today. Now, while the issue of racism in this story is too nuanced for me to do justice to it, in a few moments, I do think it's important to raise here and that this is a significant quotation. Because this is a moment where Everett links the destruction of the environment with racial injustice, because these lines ask us to consider in a wider context the practices in our society that we tolerate, that have this same unseen trickling effect of negative consequences for our planet and for specific groups of people. Moving on then to Atwood's short story called Monopoly. That's from her short story collection, Moral Disorder. And this story tells us about a young woman called Nell, who's in her 30s, and she's trying desperately to find her new identity in life. She has a new partner, and she's trying to find out who she is in that relationship. And she's also trying to be stepmother to Tig's 2 sons as well. And one way the family try to create a new start for themselves is to move to the countryside, to buy a farm, to work the land, to own animals, and to try and raise livestock. And this is all very, very new and alien to them, this close relationship with the natural world. In this story, Nell shows a sensitivity to this new natural world that she's now a part of. And she observes, the fields hadn't been worked for some time, and Queen Anne's lace and sow thistles and burdocks and saplings, hawthorns, native plums and wild apples were growing all over them. This celebration of the abundance of the natural world is immediately crushed, however, when Nell also observes there was a house on a hill overlooking the pond that the businessman had put in. On the other side of the road was a line of giant hydroelectric pylons that stretched from one horizon to the other. You could think of it as spoiling the view, or you can just incorporate it, Nell said to Tig, depending on how you felt about surrealism. Through the juxtaposition of the vibrancy and fecundity of the natural world with this image of human industry as an invading presence, Atwood is not really commenting on how humans have ruined the aesthetic look of the natural world or how we've spoiled its beautiful visual appearance. Instead, she is confronting us with the potential ominous consequences of continued human conquest of the earth. And she's also challenging us to think about how much subjugation of the environment we are willing to accept and to turn a blind eye to. Moral Disorder is another story in this short story collection of the same name. And this story follows Monopoly, and it continues to tell the story of Nell and Tig as they attempt to work the land and be seen as farmers. For me, the standout characters in this story are the animals that Nell and Tig have purchased in an attempt to run a farm and raise livestock. It's very telling that this section of the natural world, the animals, the pigs, the cows, the chickens, the ducks, the peacocks and the sheep, they always seem more confident in who they are and more ordered in how they behave compared to the incompetent, insecure and chaotic humans who have claimed ownership of them. And there are wonderful moments in this story when the animals rebel against Nell and Tig's human authority over them, and I've just picked out a couple tonight. In the first example, we are told, in September, Nell picked the less wormy and scabby apples from the apple trees and made them into jelly. One morning, Tig and Nell woke up to find a herd of drunken pigs lying under the trees, grunting and snoring in contentment. Here we have a wonderful scene where the pigs are enjoying the spoils of the apple harvest and completely disregarding any human ownership of it. In the second episode I've picked out here, we have the very sad death of a peahen, and the peacock begins to behave very strangely following this event. And we're told he took to lurking around outside the house, peering through the ground floor windows like a crazed voyeur. He knew the enemy was in there. Hate had replaced his tiny, demented head. He was bent on assassination. We should find him another mate, said Nell, but they didn't get around to it, and one day he was gone. In this episode, Nell and Tig try to maintain their control of the bird during his obvious grief. The bird, however, views them now as an enemy. He refuses to see any kind of connection with them, and he refuses to acknowledge their ownership of him anymore. So instead, he decides to choose his own path. He frees himself from their control and heads off to enjoy his life elsewhere. Now, despite the light-hearted tone of these episodes in Atwood's story, I think she's really making us question our treatment of the animals we share the earth with. And she does this by deliberately highlighting the sentience of these creatures and by showing that just like the human characters, Nell and Tig, these animals actually have a story of their own too. I just wanted to finish by maybe thinking about how we, after tonight, maybe respond to writing for the earth. And I know we have some wonderful poets coming up later on who obviously are already responding to this. But I just wanted to reiterate some of the points that were made in the introduction. I think it was maybe Catherine who had said that this definitely should be something not just for academics or researchers, but something that can go out into the wider community. So I guess I'm just quite interested to think to hear what your thoughts or ideas or suggestions or your wish list might be moving forward. And I've created a little poll or a survey on this thing called Mentimeter. And if you maybe have your phone and want to take a wee screenshot or want to take a note of those details, if you very simply just log on to mentimeter.com and type in the little code there, it gives you the opportunity just to type in some suggestions you might have. I don't know, maybe you work in a school or a community centre, or you have a project in mind that you think would work really well. It doesn't matter what age group you're thinking about. I think we're pretty certain and in agreement that, enjoying the environment, caring for the environment, taking responsibility for the environment doesn't know any age limit. So thank you very much, and please enjoy the rest of the talks.
Thank you very much, Alyssa. What a wonderful idea. I'll leave this up. Does anybody else? Everybody got that okay? Yep, brilliant. So if we go on to our final talk of this half, last but not least, get all the technical bits out of the way first. Last but not least, we have Dr. Stephen Butler, who's going to discuss the Ministry of Utmost Ecological Destruction. Stephen Butler is a lecturer at English at Ulster University. His module on utopian fiction is a desperate attempt to have the students engage with issues of climate change without descending into doomers despair. This is often an unsuccessful venture, but as with Beckett, he's feeling better all the time. Stephen Butler.
Okay, so as Amanda mentioned with the introduction, I've been teaching these books with my first years for the last few years, and in particular, the novel on the far right is a science fiction novel by Kim Stanley Robinson called Ministry of the Future. So I use this with the students, but I'm going to do the same thing now with you guys as I do with them, which is I'm going to start with the first chapter of the Ministry of the Future, which is hands down one of the bleakest chapters of fiction I've ever read. So apologies in advance for being the last one up here to put everyone on a downer before you all head to the pub. So I already have a secret thing going with the barmaid, so hopefully we'll write that in later. So before I do that and bring everyone down, I would like to stress, as I will at the end, and very much riffing off of what Lisa just said there at the very end, there are things we can be doing to make sure that we don't fall into this despair that I'm talking about. And ironically, in terms of the word minister, automatically you would think, oh, well, that's something sinister and dystopian and it's all going to be bad. But weirdly, over the last few years, the word ministry has been kind of reappropriated by utopian writers who actually see these as good things. So actually, it's right there in the title of Arundathi's book. She was not being ironic, for those of you who are thinking of reading that. It actually is a book with a kind of a happy, not so much a happy ending, but definitely it's got a more positive message than you might expect. And the Ministry of the Future is very much about showing us the future. Okay, so on that note, for those of you who don't know, the book begins, the Ministry of the Future begins, with a heat wave in India in the very near future, right? So basically what happens is one character who survives throughout most of the novel, but because of the trauma of this particular event, he ends up taking his own life because he basically witnesses 20 million people dying during a heat wave in India. And that was the first time I heard of the phrase wet bulb temperatures. Anyone know what a wet bulb temperature is? Maybe I shouldn't tell anyone then, but well, you're going to hear about it more and more over the next few years. Let's put it like that. So a wet bulb temperature is that kind of combination of temperature and humidity that countries need, ecosystems need, sorry, in order for people to live within it. There's a limit past which basically we die, right? And that's exactly what happens in the Ministry of the Future. In the near future, right? This is a sci-fi novel. It's predicting in the future, right? So as Andrew was talking about, you know, we don't expect predictions from Wordsworth. Well, one, William Blake's Ghost wants a word, Andrew. And secondly, every sci-fi writer living in present or living in dead also wants to have a word too. That's what they do, right? So there is a prediction here from the near future. And it's very sci-fi. And thankfully, we can say, well, it hasn't happened yet. Phew. Okay, so what's happening in India right now? A massive heat wave. A massive heat wave. Thankfully, we are not in the case of millions of people dying yet, but the prediction, the near future prediction, this is not science fiction anymore, this is real life. This is an article from Vice last week where Audrey Carlton talked about the fact that probably very, very soon, places like India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan will probably have exactly the situation and the scenario that was spelled out in Kim Stanley Robinson's novel. We're talking probably within the next 4 to 5 years, we may end up with this scenario, okay? So things are bleak and we need to start doing things now, right? Which I'll get back to at the end. So that's the horrible news. But as I say, there are things that we can do about this, okay? Now, you may have noticed the places that are referred to, both in the actual study and in the fiction. We're talking about India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan. Why would those areas in particular be, you know, suffering from events like this? Well, as Robinson puts it in the novel, when it comes to the climate crisis, the global south is and will be on fire. As in right now, the global south is the area of the globe that is experiencing climate crisis much worse than others. So when we talk about potential crises down the line, there are places around the world right now, the Australian wildfires, sorry, the American wildfires were mentioned earlier, right? So same thing with Australia. These things are already happening. Apocalyptic, catastrophic events are already happening. And that's going to be the norm unless we start, doing things about it, right? So the poorest parts of the world are the ones that are going to be infected. So these are all pictures taken from last week from various parts of East Africa. Kenya is currently in the middle of an absolutely massive drought, which is killing people and animals at an unprecedented rate. Ditto Somalia, ditto Ethiopia. This is what they're going through right now. Okay? Now, if you don't know anything about Africa, you might think, well, isn't that just their climate always? You know, think back to that awful, awful Band-Aid nonsense from the 80s, and that was the only pictures you got of Ethiopia. Well, yeah, I mean, things are bad, and people like Bono were part of the problem. To be perfectly blunt, but there we go. But the reason I'm mentioning that is because this will segue me into Arundhati Roy herself. So for those of you who don't know, Arundhati Roy she's a rather strange fish in contemporary fiction circles. She's written 2 novels over the course of a 30-year career. 2 novels. No, this is not James Joyce writing a 700-page masterpiece that will be studied forever. We're talking about 150-page novels that, she kind of said herself, she wrote them in no time at all. So her body of work is not substantial in the fictional land, but in terms of her non-fictional work, Arundhati Roy is much more prolific. She writes essays, she writes journal articles and things like that. And for her, there's no difference between the 2 things. Right. So this particular passage is from an essay, it's not from her fiction. But as you can see, she's pretty much saying exactly the same thing that Kim Stanley Robinson was, right? There are parts of the world that are being affected more than others. And as she mentions there, once she scratched the surface of the horrors of places like, so she mentions Rwanda, the Congo, Nigeria, add Kenya, Somalia, Ethiopia. Weirdly, Canada is one of the countries at the minute currently being affected most by climate change as well. So, these are issues, these are global issues, right? And where do these issues come from? Well, Catherine started off the whole evening talking about buzzwords that are floating about, even within academia, sustainability being one of them. Decolonization is another. Everyone should read the paper. Decolonization is not a metaphor. We don't sit around talking about it, we actually do these things, because if we don't, then these former colonial countries are going to bear the brunt, whether through war or whether through ecological catastrophes and disasters, right? So as she puts it there, pick your country and you will trace the story back to the old colonial interests of Europe and the new colonial interests of the United States. So we need to start having decolonization as a concept that's both a practical one as well as just a cultural one, right? So that's one of the things we need to start doing. The other thing, so in terms of eco-criticism, in terms of key texts that everyone should be reading, Amitav Ghosh is a fellow Indian writer. And again, it's not a coincidence that the 2 most prominent writers about ecology are both from India. So Amitav Ghosh in 2016 wrote a book basically complaining that contemporary writers don't do a good enough job informing the public about climate crisis. Fiction may talk about the environment, it may talk about climate, but bear in mind this is 2016. Up until then, for Ghosh, basically writers hadn't done their job, unless they were coming from a place like India, which is always at that same colonial history that Roy was talking about. So Ghosh kicks off the book with a very biographical thing. He lives in Bombay, and the only reason they moved there was because they were ecological migrants back in the 1800s, right? So this is it's both a recent problem, yes, but it's also a very contemporary problem as well. Or sorry, same thing, Stephen. It's a recent problem, but also an historical one as well, right? So, in terms of Roy, as I say, she's not published much. She won the Booker Prize in 1997 for her first novel, The God of Small Things. And then in terms of literary career, she disappeared. She didn't write another book until 2017. What was she doing in the meantime? Mostly activism. And in particular, she started hanging around with the NBA. Not basketball fans. She wasn't becoming, a Laker girl because of her literary career. They are an environmental protest group in India who basically protest the Indian state's imposition of dams in certain parts of the country, right? So, whilst Ghosh talks about the colonial implications of the climate crisis, Roy goes one further and says that, yes, those are all problems. What's also a problem are contemporary nation states. And if there's one writer who is critical of our country, Arundhati Roy holds no punches, right? So you've got the quotation there where she puts the ecological spin on it. India as a nation state is as horrendously bad at using its own natural resources as any of its former colonial occupiers. No more perfect example of that being the Statue of Unity in India. This is the tallest statue in the world, if you didn't know, there to commemorate the building of the dam, which you can just about see there at the bottom. This dam has caused the absolute ecological apocalypse of entire species, habitats, you name it, on top of the hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people displaced and becoming economic migrants as a result. So colonialism is a problem, but also the way that Arundhati described it as nationalist fascism has risen, and it's a massive problem. And if you think it's not related to the ecology, then you don't know much about the wonderful ecological policies that most right-wing and fascist governments have had throughout forever, right? So, as an example of what Roy does in her fiction, to riff on what a few people have mentioned today already, Roy doesn't actually write much direct ecological writing. In her essays, there's plenty of it, but in her fiction, we've got 2 novels. And having looked over the 2 novels again, I found one passage, which was not great for, like, oh my God, why am I talking about this girl at an eco-critical conference? Well, when you look at the passage here, it's about the main subject of the Ministry of Utmost Happiness, which was the partitioning of India and Pakistan back in 1947. Anyone from Northern Ireland just nods and goes, yeah, we get it. We see the similarities, right? So if you're thinking, well, what has that got to do with the environment? Well, as Kevin mentioned quite rightly, there are writers who know that once you talk about one political problem, then you scratch the surface and you'll find everything else in there as well. And India is a perfect example. The modern nation state is called an ethno-fascist state by Roy because they are responsible for genocides, literal genocides. Scratch a genocide, you'll find an ecocide. Scratch an ecocide, you'll find ethnic cleansing, you'll find ecological devastation, so on and so forth, right? So, as promised, I'll end on a positive note and also break time, right? So, yes, whilst Roy is very uncompromising in her subject matter, she's also very vocal about what needs to be done about this, right? And in that spirit of just not decolonizing for the sake of it and actually doing something about it, and exactly what Alicia did with that poll, it's like, what can we start doing on a practical level? What can we start doing right here and now? That's Roy in a nutshell. That's why she writes more essays and fiction. She wants you to get, stop sitting around having, literary talks about this. Get out there, help your local communities. So as she puts it, we need a politics of dissent. We need a politics of opposition. We need a politics of joining hands across the world to prevent certain destruction. Thankfully, events like this will help contribute, hopefully, to making sure that we don't end up destroying ourselves. Okay, thank you so much.
We're going to begin with Amanda. Her title is Made with No Ears, Humanity's Deafness to Our Planet. Amanda Mironova-Strong is a Lithuanian-born poet, currently pursuing a PhD at Ulster University, and was the editor-in-chief for the Paperclip Volume 2. She has also been a facilitator at the Seamus Heaney Home Place, and her poetry has been published in CAPs across the Threshold Anthology, The Blue Nib, Nothing Substantial, and Abridged. Her Twitter is @Mironova-Strong.
Hello, everyone. Now you get to hear from me. Today, I'd like to discuss Joy Harjo and her poetry shortly in relation to Made with No Ears, Humanity's Deafness to Our Planet. In this talk, I will question our ability to listen and argue that the exploitation of the earth is intrinsically linked to the disconnection and deafness of humans to our planet. Harjo is a Muskogee Nation member, the 23rd Poet Laureate of the United States, an author, musician, and spokesperson. And to start, I'd like to read her short poem, Rabbit is Up to Tricks. In a world long before this one, there was enough for everyone. Until somebody got out of line. We heard it was Rabbit, fooling around with clay and the wind. Everyone was tired of his tricks and no one would play with him. He was lonely in this world. So Rabbit thought to make a person. And when he blew into the mouth of that crude figure to see what would happen, the clay man stood up. Rabbit showed the clay man how to steal a chicken. The clay man obeyed. Then Rabbit showed him how to steal corn. The clay man obeyed. Then he showed him how to steal someone else's wife. The clay man obeyed. Rabbit felt important and powerful. The clay man felt important and powerful. And once that clay man started, he could not stop. Once he took that chicken, he wanted all the chickens. And once he took that corn, he wanted all the corn. And once he took that wife, He wanted all the wives. He was insatiable. Then he had a taste of gold and he wanted all the gold. Then it was land and anything else he saw. His wanting only made him want more. Soon it was countries and then it was trade. The wanting infected the earth. We lost track of the purpose and reason for life. We began to forget our songs. We forgot our stories. We could no longer see or hear our ancestors or talk with each other across the kitchen table. Forests were being mowed down all over the world, and Rabbit had no place to play. Rabbit's trick had backfired. Rabbit tried to call the clayman back, but when the clayman wouldn't listen, Rabbit realized he'd made a clayman with no ears. In an interview for the Yale Herald, Harjo explains that the art of poetry, any art discipline, any scientific or social discipline, relies on listening. Yet listening is not a skill that most of us are proficient in, and it involves more than simply hearing words. In the poem, Rabbit is up to tricks. Man has no ears. Man is deaf to the planet, indifferent to his acts, and oblivious to how they infect the earth. The poem details forests being mowed down all over the world as if they were lawns of grass, expendable and purely for show. Something of a status symbol as they provide no ecological diversity to support insects or wildlife. The ability to listen to the earth is reiterated in many of Harjo's works through stories that have been passed down from generation to generation, something which modern scientists are only now beginning to discover. In 2019, geologist Jeffrey R. Moore published a study in the Bulletin of the Seismological Society of America on Castleton Tower in Utah. Castleton Tower is a 40-foot tall rock formation that geologists have now discovered has a voice. A droning, drumming sound which Terry Tempest Williams, author and conservationist, has described as a heartbeat embedded in a low, deep vibration akin to an ultrasound of a baby becoming. In order to capture the sound, rock climbers placed seismometers at the top and bottom of the natural formation. Williams presented a recording of this low-frequency resonance to Jonah Yellowman, the spiritual advisor of the Utah Dine Nation. His response? Yes, these places speak to us. The land has always spoken to us. The sound was not a revolutionary discovery to Yellowman, and he supports Harjo's statement that there are voices inside rocks, shallow washes, shifting skies. They are not silent. And there's movement, not always the violent motion of earthquakes, but other motion, subtle, unseen, like breathing. The world is not static, nor is it absent of sound, and while this is the first time that the sound at Castleton Tower has been measured, knowledge of this occurrence, the Earth's pulse, has been with natives since their stories began some 30,000 years ago. Only we have become disconnected, displaced and alienated by our own doing of the planet that we inhabit. We have learned in our towns and our cities, as Harjo writes, not to hear the ground as it spins around beneath us. We are deaf to more than simply sound or movement. We are detached from our place to this planet as a part of the ecosystem. Why is it important then to look at poets such as Harjo? Native voices are marginalized and have been historically omitted, erased, and appropriated. Therefore, it is vital to create a space and an awareness of these writers who are often story keepers and activists. Additionally, Native voices are disproportionately affected by toxic pollution, which includes pipelines, waste incinerators, mining, nuclear waste storage, and air contamination from oil and gas industries. Each year in the United States, the oil and gas industry dumps millions of tons of airborne toxins. The Tribal Communities at Risk report by the Clean Air Task Force calculates that on tribal lands alone, this includes 18.4 billion cubic feet of methane. Subsequently, this also has a devastating effect on the breeding and migration grounds of countless species, on the wildlife, and has dangerous health issues to the residents themselves. Chickasaw writer and activist Linda Hogan notes that nature is even now too often defined by people who are separated from the land and its inhabitants. People whose interests lie with monetary value at the expense of our planet and all the species that call it home. We are perpetrating our own demise. We are allowing native lands to be destroyed, and with it, their culture, their stories, their knowledge. What else are we discovering for supposedly the first time because the knowledge was lost? Or because we didn't take the time or the effort to listen? In Poet Warrior, Harjo talks about plants and how she becomes sensitive to plant politics and their individual presence by actively listening. Harjo describes a story in her memoir of introducing a new plant into the household amongst existing ones, only to find they didn't really get along and all started to wilt. By paying attention and moving the plant to a different location, they all thrived. It's a very simple story, but in it, she emphasizes and constantly emphasizes in her other works that our physical living is held together by plant sacrifice. We eat, wear, and are sheltered by plants and plant materials. Nearly all of our medicines are plant-derived. As someone whose home is also overcrowded by plants, I'm aware of their subtleties and how certain leafy inhabitants can become divas if their watering is even an hour late. But they are our source of oxygen, and they're vital to our survival, and like Castleton Tower, they have vibrations and voices that should not be reduced to decorations or a backdrop. As Rabbit recognized that he'd made a clay man with no ears, it's time that we acknowledge we are not the superior species, that we are not the only ones with voices, simply that we are the loudest. And it's time that we learn silence. Even in the smallest, often invisible aspects of our environment, such as houseplants or soaring rock formations such as Castleton Tower, are voices worth listening to. Our planet is not our backdrop. As Harjo stresses repeatedly, the journey to coexisting and finding our place in this diverse ecosystem begins with us and listening. This evening, if you walk away with nothing else, I'll implore you to consider the following questions. Firstly, one that Williams asks herself constantly. What kind of violence am I perpetrating on this planet? Secondly, in The Rabbit is Up to Tricks, Harjo details man's insatiable drive for consumption and greed, and questions, do we have ears? Are we using them? Thank you.
Next, we have Dr. Kathleen McCracken with Mustangs, or The Ballad of Gideon Light, a poetry/photography response to sacrifice zones in the American West. Dr. Kathleen McCracken is a Canadian poet and lecturer in creative writing at Ulster University in Northern Ireland. She is the author of 8 collections of poetry, among them Blue Light, Bay and College, and a bilingual English-Portuguese edition entitled Double Self-Portrait with Mirror, New and Selected Poems. Kathleen.
I'm going to talk to you a little bit briefly as possible here, I think, about how forms of environmental depredation figure in a book-length long poem, which I've been working on for the past few years. And it is entitled Mustangs, or The Ballad of Gideon Light. Before I can talk about the aspects of this work which have to do with environmental depredation, I need to tell you a little bit about the backstory to this project. It originated in a conversation with another writer about, well, we were talking about minimalist writing, and the question arose as to whether a single word could embody an entire story, or could a poem be one word in length? And it kind of stuck with me, and so for a few days I thought about this. And the word that presented itself to me, I suppose, rather than that I searched for, was the word Mustang, which all of you will know and know is, besides being a sports car and a World War II airplane, the wild horse of the American West, which was brought by the Spanish. It's actually a hybrid horse, which is part stray from, domesticated environment and part feral, part wild. So it's a hybrid. And I like that idea. And as I started writing these little pieces, they're 3-line pieces that have become a long poem. The Mustang became not so much a character as a figure, I think, in this long work that I've been working on. He is a mixed blood. He is part Caucasian and part Indigenous. He's itinerant and he's a shapeshifter. I don't know, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't know of any traditional shapeshifter who is a horse and a human. So he might be an original in that way. Anyways, his story is that he's drifting around the North American West, lonely, haunted, trying to make sense of his own life and observing this changed and changing environment that he's moving through. In some ways, he's like the ancient mariner or Ishmael. He seems to have this sense of guilt, or that he's running from his own guilt or confronting his own guilt. And part of that guilt has to do with what he sees in the American landscape, what's happening to it, the depredation of the natural environment. So the sequence started with the poem I'm showing you here, a poem telling a story in one word, Mustang. And it was a throwaway. I thought it would be a bit of an in-joke with the person that I've been discussing this with. But I couldn't stop writing these pieces. And the 2 that I have up there, they're really the frame for the whole sequence. The first one and the last one, double self-portrait with Mir, who's the Mustang, is it you or is it me? Which I guess encourages reader involvement and makes you as the reader or listener think about your own involvement with the things that Gideon Light moves through. Just to say a little bit about the form, and then I'll get to the environmental depredation. It is a book-length long poem. It consists of 144 3-line segments, which I have called Mustangs. The word Mustang appears once in the title or the body of each of these little pieces. They're haiku-like. They probably owe something to the couplet as well. Some of them rhyme, some of them don't. Some of them have regular meter, others are free verse. But however musical they may or may not be, I've always thought of them more as snapshots or glimpses, or very, very visual in the pictures that they present, verbal photographs. And it was out of that thinking, I guess, of them as being visual that they became a collaboration with the Northern Ireland filmmaker, photographer, John T. Davis, who had done a series of photographs, black and white photographs of the American West in the 1980s when he was making a film out there. So he very kindly shared those photographs with me, and we've come around to making an exhibition with my 144 Mustangs and his 44 black and white photographs. The sequence is also done as a musical live performance, spoken word music performance. A film poem is in the works, and eventually a book. So that's the background to this project. These are a few of the photographs. I just wanted you to see them. None of them have to do with environmental depredation, pollution per se, but a lot of them have to do with decay, nostalgia, the loss of something that was once highly valued in terms of American environment and Canadian environment, North American environment and culture. So this is in Oklahoma, Arizona, the Wigwam Motel, Pioneer Drive-In in Texas, and a flop house in Los Angeles. There are a lot more of them, but those are just to give you a flavor of what the photographs are like. So as I was writing these pieces, and they grew exponentially, I think, I just, for a while that seemed to be all I could write were these 3-liners. But the more of them I wrote about this fellow Gideon Light, the more I realized that there had to be something said about what was happening with the natural environment. So this wasn't the first one in that direction. I mean, he does all kinds of other things. There's kind of inquisitions into things like toxic masculinity and capitalism, etc., decolonialization. But the ones that have to do with the environment, this was written probably in the sort of the middle of the sequence. But it's called Define Slow Violence, and most of you will probably know what slow violence is, but slow violence is climate change, things that don't happen suddenly, like a uranium bomb, but that over a period of time, the environment is slowly destroyed. So things like deforestation and toxic waste spills, the aftermath of war, as we're seeing at the moment, that's slow violence. So this little piece is called Define Slow Violence, and it comes out of something that happened in September of 2020, when in New Mexico, a whole lot of birds fell from the sky and they were dead on the ground, and ornithologists were speculating about why this would have happened. And it seemed to be that because of the wildfires which had raged across the West for most of that summer, the birds had become dehydrated and disorientated, and thus the sort of mass death that was observed there. So this one defines slow violence. Mustang counting exhausted swallows drop dead from Jemez, Roswell, Socorro skies. There are a lot of issues that I look at across these poems that have to do with the environment in this sequence. Things like drought and the wildfires, increasing temperatures, species extinction, and sacrifice zones. For those of you that don't know, a sacrifice zone is a geographical area that has been permanently impaired by heavy environmental alterations. And the ones that I looked at specifically here, those areas, those sacrifice zones, are in the Canadian Northwest, northern Alberta principally, where the oil sands or the tar sands are. There's oil extraction. And Stephen, you were asking about why Canada is one of the countries that has the highest statistics for climate change and the fallout of that. It is because of the oil sands, the tar sands there. So I was looking at that. Also uranium mining and water poisoning, land poisoning in the American Southwest. I'd been through those territories and had also read a good bit about it. So that was something that really struck home with me. The impact that that's had on Native people there, particularly the Navajo and the Pueblo people, has been tremendous over the years since the 1940s. So that seeps into the poems. And then I did a sequence on the Dakota Access Pipeline protests, the No DAPL protests of 1916, which took place on the Standing Rock Reservation in North Dakota. A particular company wanted to build a pipeline between North Dakota and Illinois, and it was going to go under the Mississippi and under the Missouri rivers, and if there was ever a spill, it would cause unmentionable damage to the water supply system, as well as all the surrounding areas. The Native people living on those reservations near that oil pipe were very concerned, and no doubt you saw all that in the news at the time. So that's just a bit of what goes into these very short little pieces. So I'd just like to read a few of them for you to give a sense of what I'm trying to do with this. I think I would have said that people need to tell stories, that without telling the stories about what we've had, what we've lost, what we stand to lose, that knowledge doesn't get passed on. And I suppose writing poems in this direction are an effort to give some variety of a story to readers, to future generations. So I'll read a few of these for you. And so Mustang mourns the mother tree, felled her old growth heartwood, the continent's deep map. Eden is burning, bootleg, Dixie, Lytton, Caldor, Mustang's rangelands wreathed in wildfire. Scorched earth lamentatio, in the charred aftermath, Mustang's heart-halved Ullaloo. How to survive fire. Ear to the burnscape, Mustang dowsing for seed split, cone pop, and the chatter of dormant buds. Mustang describes the water wars. Every creek bed a dry creek bed, every wash a symphony in stone. Death Valley cadenza, Fahrenheit 129. That albatross, those water snakes, and Mustang, his begging bowl, his crossbow. Sacrifice Zone, Athabasca oil sands, the Delta, where boreal forest once, Mustang spitting bitumen on bitter ground. Sacrifice Zone, Athabasca oil sands, Fort McKay. Mustang's abacus, minus caribou, plus cut lines, minus whitefish, plus wastewater, minus black spruce, plus acid rain. Sacrifice Zone, Mustang surveys Monticello uranium mill. How to forget, Gideon, what the cells remember. Sacrifice Zone, Four Corners, radium, thorium, the devil's yellow dust, Mustang witness to the root of unjust. Sacrifice Zone, Shiprock, Navajo Nation, Mustang hoved up at Many Devil's Wash, groundwater steeped in raffinate leach. Sacrifice Zone, Louisiana, the Gulf. After Cancer Alley, Mustang grieving the Mississippi's cancerous mouth. Sacred Stone Camp, April 2016. Splitting firewood, pitching tents, Mustang dug in with the water protectors. Hashtag no DAPL, hashtag no DAPL, Missouri, Mississippi, Oahe, Cannonball, Mustang mouthing the rallying call. Oceti-Sakowin, September 2016. Unfit for sleep, Mustang's wits, a bolus of black snakes. Winter Camp, October 2016. Attack dogs, water cannon, tear gas, riot gear, from the Pinto Corral, Mustang's jeer. Water is life. Mini Wichoni, Mini Wichoni, Mini Wichoni, Mustang in the frostbite sub-zero. Thank you.
Next, we have Angeline Kelly with Creative Writing for the Earth. Angeline Kelly is a writer in residence of Ulster University and a creative writing PhD candidate in her second year. Angeline writes primarily in the novel format, but has also written poetry, short stories, and history. What ties all her work together is an interest in shared culture in Northern Ireland, international perspectives, languages, and dialect. Her latest novel, Dusty Bluebells, is partly written in Ulster Scots. Angeline.
Okay, so I'm going to start by reading a little excerpt from my work in progress. It's a novel called Dear William, and a good bit of the way through the novel now. And when I signed up for the PhD, I sort of thought I was going to come along with something really profound and literary and all the rest of it. And I ended up just enjoying myself so much. So thank you to Frank and Kathleen for allowing me to really enjoy this PhD novel. So I'm going to start by with this little excerpt then. Whatever I had gripped in my hands was not a table. I held out my arms to protect my face, and Adrian's voice came in whispers. You all right? I was not all right. I was in tears. My back ached, and a giant wooden doll was pressing down on my chest. A soft light illuminated the stairwell, and my eyes adjusted to it. That's when I saw a set of black eyes staring back at me. Jesus. There I was, lying on Adrian McClement's stairs, in the arms of a 3-foot-tall black Jesus, carved from oak, and every Protestant bone in my body stiffened from the shock of it. I placed Jesus back at the top of the stairs, not knowing if I should laugh, cry, or pray, and tiptoed down towards Adrian, whose torch was now awakening the Sacred Heart of the white Jesus over the telephone table. Meet Stephanie, protagonist of my PhD novel Dear William, a diary novel set in 1995. Stephanie is a bright young Presbyterian, a founding member of the generation of toleration and respect, whose goals are to find a suitably Catholic boyfriend and to save the planet. Dear William is fictional, but there is some autobiographical truth in the novel. I took an interest in conservation when I learned about global warming in geography in 1987. So it's interesting, actually, Niamh, to hear what you've said. You said you're 26. So I'm 46, and we were told that we were the generation that had to save the planet. And it was all, ozone layer and rising sea levels and all the rest of it when we were at school. So we all felt the need to join the Conservation Society, which was what we did. So this was great for me because I couldn't handle a hockey stick or play a violin, but I had excellent cleaning skills. So our first litter pick, we tackled a mountain of crisp packets, sanitary towels, beer bottles and Coke tins in the muddy shore of Larnloch. The concept of bottled water was so far-fetched back then that we never imagined it would be anything other than fuel for a sitcom sketch featuring Del Boy. So if you're 26, you maybe won't get that bit. But anybody else might remember that scene here who's of a certain age. Bottles of pop were only starting to catch on. Fast forward to the noughties, and I was travelling globally with work, often consuming 3 small disposable bottles of water on a flight. I had the chance to taste the polluted air in Beijing, see hundreds of miles of concrete in Sao Paulo, watch cattle graze in fields filled with plastic waste in India, witness Dubai and Abu Dhabi rise from the desert, and journey along Japanese highways with power stations so vast that Ballylumford and Kilroot looked like quaint little cottages by comparison. Somehow everything got worse. And now that I have my troubles novels off my chest, I must return to my teenage preoccupation and write for the earth. Speculative fiction is the ideal way to explore the what-if scenario. What if Larne Town is flooded and we all have to move to Ballymena? Disaster. What if, for the Ballymena people probably, what if we must take car-copter rides to visit our friends in Cave Hill? So these ideas have come from the likes of Biddy Lee and Joe Zebedee, who I know from Women Aloud, and they handle such eventualities well. But what about the realists? How can we introduce environmental themes and not lose sight of character, plot, and the magic that makes our novels fiction and not fact? And how does a diary novelist achieve this while simultaneously avoiding pontification in the first-person narrative, which, by the way, is very tempting, and I have already culled lots of lines where I just go off on one. So it's kind of reining it in all the time when you're writing in the first person. So slapstick and corporeal expression in Dear William have allowed me to use comedy to reveal character and feel sympathy for the protagonist, providing a safe landing spot for hard-hitting themes. We see Stephanie tumble down the stairs, clutching a 3-foot wooden Jesus, and the reader is entertained. We see her faced with environmental disruption, and the reader has a chance to think. Stephanie says a few salient words, and some of you might recognise them from Glasgow 2021. So this is another little excerpt, and I wrote this after I actually visited Culwater Castle, which is just outside Larne. It's a rundown castle, but the castle wasn't the thing that captured my imagination that day. After a bend in the road of disputed legal status, something caught my eye that conflummoxed me. I saw white, more white, prefabricated buildings, also white. All was white, a giant crater of summer snow. God, I cried, as a shiver as cold as spindrift shot down my back. The limestone quarry, said Adrian. You'd hardly know it was there unless you passed it in a helicopter. I need to curse. He laughed. Go on then, Miss Girls Brigade. Let it all out. I'm not going to say it because I was a Girls Brigade girl and my captain might be looking down on me now, so I won't say the F word. You can use that in your imagination. The spindrift bristled through me and I thought of the standing stone up in the hills. Fires raging all summer. Thunderbolts ripping up the land. Meteorites, bombs, dead trees and dead wolves. The quarry was the size of Larne town centre, and within it was an ecosystem of buildings and vehicles busier than all the shops and cars and buses on Main Street. Everything was coated in the most sleeked of snow, and I was cold. What's the point, I said. We're digging our own grave. So you might have heard that at Glasgow. The purpose of the dialogue between Adrian and Stephanie is to express character, grow their relationship, and channel a family history subplot. But it is also designed to relay to the reader the environmental history of the setting, including mass deforestation following the Ulster plantation, fires in the early 1800s. It was interesting to see that fire across the Mourns, because I was writing at that time about a fire across Agnews Hill that happened, I think, around 1823. The lost wolf, and that area is also significant for the lost wolf. The absence of deer, the road is called Deer Park Road, but there are no deer. And the growth of sheep and cattle farming. All of this sits alongside the story of Larne's hereditary bards, the O'Neill family, who lamented the loss of their profession when faced with political change and the fate of pastoral farming in the early 1600s. So these environmental themes in the area have been going way back to the Gaelic bards. They witnessed the deforestation, so they talked about it in their poems. At the centre of the action is Agnews Hill, a mountain, and a character with eyes. The characters in Dear William become implicated in landscape, and the landscape is personified. Language is a central theme in this novel, and I use some Ulster Scots. You might have picked up a few of those words there, like conflummoxed and so on. Overtly throughout vocabulary and idiom, and covertly through rhythm, syntax, and word structure. A tongue can colonise and pollinate like fireweed. I'm still writing Dear William, and the novel is continually coloured by the present day. The year selected is that of the first Drumcree Parade's dispute, a symbolic event in our history. In the novel, I explore the idea that in order to survive, humanity requires contact, no matter how fractured. While the trauma of the event cannot be overstated, the contact of one man looking another man in the eye through a barricade merits investigation. It is a situation that sits opposite to indifference. The conclusion of Dear William is yet to be written. If global events we've witnessed since my PhD began in September 2020 are anything to go by, someone else might write the conclusion for me. My plan, however, is to show that the enemy of humanity is indifference, that the enemy of the earth is indifference. Of all the places in the British Isles, this part of Ireland has the potential to crush indifference. I will end with a poem written by my protagonist, Stephanie Agnew. Standing Stone at Mullock Sandal. How many have knelt down in the absence of narrow pews to be at one with a past vaster than that which we know? Usurpers grow like fireweed, tall and vigorous, scattering seeds needlessly, heralding names like Sandal, McQuillan, O'Neill, and Agnew. They will come again to plant the trees in case it's worth believing you, who saw civilizations and stars fall. Will they say that man stood the stone to standing? Thank you. It's quite hard to do.
Well, last but most certainly not least is Niamh McNally with speculative fiction and poetry. Niamh McNally is a Belfast-based poet. She completed her MA at Ulster University, where she co-created and edited The Paperclip, a student-led publication. Since then, Niamh has been a facilitator in the Seamus Heaney Home Place, and her poetry can be seen in publications such as the Tulsa Review, Tiernan Og, Capsule Stories, and the Galway Review. Just recently, Niamh's poetry featured on the BBC and in the NI Human Rights Commission film It Seems, which focuses on the climate crisis. Her poem, If Stone Could Speak, was showcased by Bushmills as promotion for the Causeway Collection, and Niamh's most recent poetry film, Defining Hope, was commissioned for and premiered at the Business in the Community 2021 Responsible Business Awards. A section of this poem was read by the esteemed actor Michelle Fairley in the Ulster Hall for the BBC event Fanfare for the Makers, and the Ulster Orchestra played after each piece of writing. Niamh.
Hi everyone, thank you, and thank you so much to Amanda and Connor for organising this, having me. I'm excited to get stuck into some eco poetry. I've called this it's weird. I feel like an academic and I'm usually just reading poetry. I've called this Our Imminent Atlantis. Basically, this comes from a poem I wrote and how I see the future of this world if we don't make a change. It's my talk on nature writing, the climate crisis, eco-anxiety and hope. I will try and get through as much as I can and hopefully I won't run over time. So, like I said, when asked to write an abstract for this symposium, I did feel my usual imposter syndrome. I could never call myself a scientist or an eco-critic or sometimes even an eco-writer for that matter, but I've always been both drawn to and obsessed by the natural world, specifically our destructive impact, which everyone has mentioned. My work ranges from oysters to crabs with no claws, encroaching ivy suffocating a wall, Arctic walruses, Belfast being an ancient ruin, submerged lighthouses, and what St. Francis of Assisi might have thought about rotisserie chicken or bird cages. So there's quite a variety there. I do often align my obsession with the climate crisis and death with hope and how we can change things. Amanda's a big advocate for art being primarily and, an absolute central part of the global revolution. So yeah, this is my lighthouse, but I'll talk about that in a second. So on the left here, if anyone knows me or has been to a poetry reading before, I always read this poem. I'm actually just going to paraphrase today because you're probably sick of listening to it. To the left, I wrote a poem about eating oysters for the first time at Greencastle after Seamus Heaney. That was the title of the poem. Somebody told me oysters were vegan, so I thought this was okay. Yeah. So yeah, they don't have a central nervous system. If anybody wants to quote me on that, I justify in the Tabasco. So yeah, I ate an oyster for the first time, and I thought about Heaney's poem from the first poem in Fieldwork, Oysters, how an oyster is ripped from its oyster bed, how we as humans it's harsh, but there's a lot of rape imagery. When I use it in the poem, it's viciously shucked with expert ease. The oyster reveals plump plasma, a snottery act slurped back, and frank snottery, as we talk about with Conway Stewart and Seamus Heaney Home Place. I thought snottery was the perfect verb to describe eating an oyster. If anyone doesn't know what snottery is, maybe look it up. But as poets, writers, and critics, we interrogate words and use words to, as Emily Dickinson describes, tell the truth, but tell it slant. In the same vein of thought, literally, we use linguistic exploitation to cover up brutal crimes against the non-human world to make ourselves feel better. Pork is not a squealing pig. Beef is not a cow standing in a cage outside an abattoir. Disassociation is how these industries have prevailed. And I want to challenge this. And it's always like this way it's always been mentality. I want to challenge this. But on the right here, we have Ivy. My lovely friend Karis illustrated this poem for me. For the romantics in here, this actually is about Ivy consuming the house. I've described it as having layering suffocation. When you exploit something, I often think it'll come back and have its revenge. So I like to think that Ivy's coming from the back wall to the front of the house, and I've described it as a clinging romantic. So what exactly is eco-anxiety? It's been described as the chronic fear of environmental cataclysm that comes from observing the seemingly irrevocable impact of climate change. With this, I started thinking more about the environment itself. My friend Hannah actually beautifully illustrated this lighthouse to the left-hand side. I often think of a lighthouse as hope. I kind of became obsessed after reading Virginia Woolf and lighthouses. But the thing is, I always associate it with hope as if you're a sailor in the sea and you see a lighthouse. It is a glimpse of hope, and I like to think we have that with the time we still have left in the climate crisis. I describe the lighthouse as needing stacked with a few more stripes, another layer of red, white, to lift the head higher and push its sight above submerging waves, gargling salt water, panicking through the suffocation. Tear ducts flood as light struggles to stay on, like slapping a dying torch with your palm, a hopeless hand. The batteries have drowned. So this complete submersion underwater is how I imagine the future to be, like our imminent Atlantis. And if we move over to the right, a devastating scene. This was on Netflix. I'm not too sure if anyone watched it last year. It was Our Planet. It was narrated by David Attenborough, but it was about walruses hauling out of the water in the Baltic Sea. The ice had completely melted and they tried to climb an 80-foot cliff. It was described as the disturbing walrus scene in Our Planet. Thousands of them died. They were just plummeting to their death because there was no ice. This honestly just impacted me in such a way that I had to write it down. And this is a devastating scene. A tragedy of bodies piled at the base of an 80-foot cliff. Tusks puncture blubber. Ivory impales backs, bellies, eyes. Life runs from leathery coats into Russian waters under Arctic skies. Skulls crack on wetted rocks, stacking the beach with figures of furrowed blocks. Wrinkled blobs morph into a mass grave of hemorrhaging greys and browns. Nothing to do but watch. Straight into our lens, your flippers extend, a tilt from the rock face then, spread into a crucifixion pose, a vain execution. A limp creature in slow motion begins its death descent. The lack of grip, a final tumble, a blind stumble, the hauling out to the water, the stupidity of it all, the fall. Why are they doing this? They aren't made for climbing cliffs. They had nowhere else to go, you replied. They had nowhere else to sit. And like I said, I had been in films the past 2 years. I was commissioned to the left-hand side here. The Human Rights Commission asked me to write a poem about the climate crisis, which is very difficult when you're given a brief, when you're a poet. I don't know, Kathleen, and you're the same as well. And it's difficult, but you try to avoid cliche at all manners. But being in front of a screen, being in front of a camera and trying to recite your own poetry 80 times around Belfast directly to a camera was difficult. But this is It Seems, and I'm going to read it to finish us off tonight. But I'm going to just talk about these two poems. So It Seems was more about the climate crisis. It was about our impact, how it's about, it's not happening to us right now, so it shouldn't affect us. We didn't treat the crisis like a crisis, and this was the same as Defining Hope. Defining Hope was coming out of lockdown. This was released in September of last year. As soon as there was a crisis in Belfast, in the world, everyone acted like it was a crisis. But until there's floods at our door, until there's bushfires in our part of the world, they're happening right now. Stephen just said, people are having to evacuate their homes, and because it's not happening here, people don't care. But as soon as people had to wear masks, so there was no toilet roll, there seemed to be an actual crisis. But I'm going to read It Seems after this slide. So we took those poems and I read them outside Stormont. This is how I like to see, Frank, like direct change. Taking your poems, reading them in front of audiences. This was the first ever Northern Ireland Climate Festival, which happened last year. We just stood outside on a picnic bench in front of Stormont, which is epic. But this is going to continue to happen. And the fact is, this is a way of showing, giving awareness, creating awareness for the climate, giving it a voice, giving a voice to the voiceless, which I continuously try to do. Another form, not only film and poetry, but art. The amazing Cara, I love her work. She illustrates most things I do, and I absolutely torture her for it. But art, I think, makes poetry pop even more. I've always kind of been more of a visual when it comes to poetry. And see the middle, I talk about chrysanthemums. Here, I describe poetry as nature, and nature, actually, maybe it doesn't want to come back. If we're not fighting for nature, why should it defrost every year? I describe it as in deathbeds of rotten snow, withering elemental petals succumb to inevitable frost and refuse to fight. Lost at night, do trees cry when winter stops? With clear liquid dripping external sap, their flexed branches fracture back into longer life. A crackling deity limbering in defrosting oil. Do they crave Earth's living form at all? So I'm going to just read it in a couple of minutes. Is that okay, Amanda? And I'll finish up. So this is It Seems, and thank you for listening, everybody. Hope we can take away excellent points from everybody as legends. This was amazing. Thank you so much. It seems that no one chooses to care until the very air we breathe becomes infected, and the cigarette chimneys of the fuel industries fills our lungs with smog. It seems that until it arrives at our door, do we choose to ignore those fending for their lives in places that are not here, and for people who are not us, within our imminent Atlantis. Yet why is it that when we are repeatedly told we are amidst the 6th mass extinction, do we not bat an eyelid? It won't be in my lifetime anyway, is a mantra we always say, and the immediacy of our house burning down is tainted by the lack of smoke and the joke, well, I won't be here to see it. And yes, I know we've been told that consuming vegan sausage rolls or refilling metal water bottles will do its part. And yes, they are a start, but let's aim our reduce, reuse and recycling arrows away from our hearts for a moment. Let's instead point them toward those who oppose that climate change is not an issue of human rights, and shed some light on a topic that should not be up for discussion. It is often the case that facts trickle through gaps in talks, are filtered by the media, stained by companies and diluted into a crisis that barely colours the water. Issues such as flash flooding, bushfires and rapid global urgency feels less like our planet needs surgery and has a sniffle that sugarcoats with a cough bottle. It seems we've been told about polar ice caps too often, or rising sea levels we cannot see just yet. But my granny telling me that her daffodils bloomed early in February set alarm bells ringing. And the lack of dead insects on our car number plates after a drive seemed chilling. And warmer winters in this part of the world not seeming like that much of a struggle. There is one misconception though, and it is of the small window of time we have left. When I mention climate change, I think how strange it is we think our planet's in danger. Habitats will grow back without us. Ivy will consume every brick whilst plants dismantle bridges, and our buildings will become overgrown ruins. The sea will breathe again beneath its plastic cover, and ecosystems will flourish when Mother Nature reclaims what's hers. So this comes down to our future. Our right to water, shelter, and the very air we breathe is being determined by the greed of big companies. We need to mobilise and rise against those who keep the cure from us, who continue to burn carbon and destroy the rainforests. We must use our voices to undo the choices they make, because climate change reaches every single one of us and breaches our very right to life. Thank you.
Brilliant, Niamh. Thank you so much. Fabulous. There's time for a few questions to either the second half of the panel or everybody. Does anybody have any questions? Or what do I think?
I don't have a question. It's just a point, if I may.
Yes, go for it.
It's a superb symposium. We've travelled through time, through history, gone into science fiction, we've gone into the future. We've travelled the world.
Yeah.
With the lines. We've travelled to Ireland. We've been everywhere in this symposium. It's been superb.
Good.
One thing that sticks in my mind is just a small sentence that was made, and it's, there is no more new water. What we
indeed.
have is what we have. If we don't look after it, we're not going to get anything more.
Yeah.
That's all.
Quite, I agree. There you go. That was Alyssa's point, wasn't it? I think. Yes, excellent. Thank you for that. Excellent. Anybody else? Any on? Yes. There are microphones. There's microphone 2 beneath you there, Kevin. If you would.
Lost my place now. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. Question mainly for Amanda, but Kate, before I forget, this business about horses turning into humans and vice versa, just before I forget, Bottom in Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream basically does that. His suitor wakes up and says, "Methinks I was enamoured of an ass." Not quite a horse, a donkey, but that type. It's a quadruped. So just before I forget, remember that. Amanda, also on the Shakespeare thing, that poem about rabbits, I'm fairly sure that that's based on a speech by Caliban in The Tempest, where he more or less says that I'm like you because you taught me how to do these terrible things. The reason why I engage in toxic masculinity, the reason why I plunder my environment, the reason why I behave like a savage is because you came and taught me these ways. It's the colonized saying of a colonizer, you did this to me, I behave like this because you set things up this way for me. So that's just a wee point before I forget. A question for you. which might sound a little bit confrontational. I promise you it's not meant to be. And it's inspired by, Jan's not here tonight, he's looking after his goddaughter. But anyway, Jan drove me up to Derry a year or two ago to listen to a talk by Mahatma Gandhi's grandson. And Gandhi's grandson pontificated and waffled about the way his grandfather had taught him about the efficacy of frugality and using resources wisely and not wasting things, basically. And I spoke to Mahatma's grandson and I said to him, listen, waste, waste, waste. Capitalism generates this waste. The reason why we have our hair cut 12 times a year is because of capitalism. The reason why we buy a new car every 3 years is because of capitalism. The reason why we fill up our houses with tat is because of capitalism, because somebody is making money out of it. Profit, profit, profit. And I said to him, listen, Gandhi's grandson, won't you please accept or acknowledge that capitalism is the problem? People wanting to make money is the problem. But he'd just been on a nice first-class flight and he'd just been wined and dined, and he doesn't really want to criticise the rich. And like I said, honestly, Amanda, I don't mean to be confrontational about this, but do you feel that ecologists, people who condemn waste, those of us who lament the absolute insane obsession with buying and buying and buying, that don't we realise that ecological waste is caused by capitalism? In other words, it's a genuine question. I'm not putting this on you. It's a genuine philosophical question. As ecologists, do we have to also reject capitalism?
Yeah, talk about no pressure, giving me the philosophical question of the evening. That's a very difficult one to answer. Consumer culture is really what has probably put us in this place, what has put us in such a difficult position where we are struggling. We're like, there's no more water. A species can't go extinct and we can't bring it back. It's not Jurassic World. We can't bring these animals back. So yes, consumerism and capitalism is something that is causing issues. It's also something that we have been conditioned to accept and conditioned to want. We have been socially, conditioned to want loads of new dresses and change our cars constantly, and we all want the newest iPhones. And yes, that's the biggest part of the problem is, why are we buying new things if they're not broken? Why aren't we fixing things instead of, binning them, instead of sewing the stockings? Why aren't we throwing them out? So yes, I would say that there's a lot of problems there with consumerism, with capitalism, but I can't speak for all ecologists. But yes, we have to stop wasting. I do agree with that.
So yeah, on the ecologist front, Jason Murr is an ecologist who was one of the first to not exactly coin the phrase the Anthropocene, which has been mentioned a few times tonight, but definitely was one who was engaging on it from an early point. But in the last few years, he says we need to stop talking about that and we need to start using the phrase the capitalocene, because exactly what Kevin said is what he says is look, and it's kind of what Niamh was intimating as well. Structural change needs to happen. Like, we can make personal individual choices, which is what a lot of young people struggle with because they're told at school, do this, do that. But that's not enough. We know it's not enough. So it does need to be more structural. It does need to be more, and to Niamh's other point, what do we do about this? At some point, it's going to be civil disobedience. I'm not saying we have to blow up pipelines, but we start blowing stuff up. We went for Northern Ireland, for God's sake. We've got forms, so... But yeah, to that point, yeah, I think we do need to start using phrases like the capitalocene more, because absolutely spot on. You're right that these are the kind of levels of changes that we're going to need going forward.
Thank you. To Kevin's question, I would just say big yes. capitalism. But I think as well, it's hard to kind of get out of these webs that are just totally spun. And something really, really dawned on me. We were down in Armagh at a Eco Symposium for St. Patrick's Day, and Professor John Barry from Queen's said, unbelievable. He's like, what's his Twitter bio was like reform politician or something like that. He's so great. But he said that every time he gets the first years in uni, in their first class, he'll say, okay, everybody put your books down, look around you. Name me something in this room that doesn't have carbon or didn't get here through the use of carbon, or was it made by carbon? And everyone was kind of like, okay, where did this travel from? Like, how did this chair get here? Did it come from China? How did you get here today? And it's easy to go to, like, I don't know, a charity shop and maybe buy a dress that you, like this one that I got today, and get something like that. But it's these kind of, these bigger issues that are happening. Why don't we all drive electric cars? There's no means to do it right now, but it's taking those small steps. People can't afford it. If you're working class, you're hardly going to say, yes, electric car, no petrol. It's these huge issues that need tackled, like I said, from the top down and not from the bottom up. And yeah, it's something to maybe think about. I'd say it's all to do with capitalism. The spike in eco resources falling from the Industrial Revolution. I remember seeing a chart that started here and it's now up here within 100 years. So yes, capitalism is the reason we're in this position, I think. And it will inevitably destroy itself, hopefully.
Well, a thorough question, thoroughly answered. Thank you very much for that. Would anybody else like to say anything to that? I think then we could move to Amanda for our closing remarks. Amanda, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much to everybody, to all our speakers. If I could get you to have another round of applause for everyone this evening. It's certainly been an enlightening evening, and I hope you've taken something away from this. Hopefully something, if anything, hopefully something. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for attending, whether in person and online. It's part of what makes these things like this possible, and it's part of what is the step towards change, is attending things like this, is listening, is seeing what we can do. We'd like to thank Ulster University and the Riverside Theatre for hosting. Thank you very much. We appreciate it. We'd like to thank Dr. Frank Ferguson, our research director, who entertained our little notion and then let it flourish. Thank you. And thank you for Catherine White for your lovely words today as well. We'd like to thank all the speakers, and we hope you enjoy this evening. We hope that you took something away and that you care about our environment maybe a little bit more, that like Niamh was told, like Angeline, we are all being told that we are the generation that has to do something. We are the generation that has to change something. And quite frankly, I don't want my little brother who's 8 years old to have that burden on his shoulders. I think it's something that we should all be taking a step towards. So thank you again. And if you are interested in further events and further news, you can follow us on Twitter at Writing for Earth, or email us directly at writingfortheearth@gmail.com. A recording of this will be available sometime soon, and hopefully it is the beginning of many new things and many events to follow. Thank you.